colleagues and friends. Please welcome on stage Harpinder Collacott, Executive Director for Mercy Corps Europe.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our closing panel for the Stockholm Forum for Peace and Development, Seeking Solutions for Turbulent Times. My name is Harpinder Collacott. I'm the Executive Director of Mercy Corps in Europe, and it's my pleasure today to be hosting and moderating this final panel for closing up our two-day forum. I've got some esteemed panellists with me, but before I start to introduce my panellists and go into our discussion, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to just recap over the last 2 days. It's been an incredible last couple of days of panels and parallel sessions, which all of you have been participating in and involved in designing and running. And I think what's really important about the Stockholm Peace Forum is the way that it's co-created and designed to ensure that we're bringing the variety of voices and ideas into the discussions. It's important in shaping and identifying ideas for the future. It's really critical in defining what's possible in strengthening the international community, but also particularly bringing peace-building stakeholders together to have these discussions in and around the sessions, but also in the social sections of the agenda as well. So I hope you've all had a very strong, good couple of days. You made some new connections, but you've also been able to identify some new partnerships, which has been very much a running theme throughout this forum. Now, firstly, day one laid out some of the dynamics of the complex world we're seeing at the moment, the crisis that we're all facing, and we spent quite a bit of time on day one really looking at the various different crises that we're all grappling with today, including the Russian war in Ukraine, the global food crisis. We discussed the intensifying pressures of climate change and environmental degradation, but also the challenges to democracy, including the resurgence of authoritarianism and the fast-closing civic space. Day two brought a lot more emphasis on bringing stakeholders together across all levels, starting from the international level all the way down to the hyperlocal. We heard a number of solutions about actually how these partners need to come together and work to find various different solutions. We heard also about the importance of coalitions and partnerships, but not just coalitions and partnerships that are made up of those of us who are often in these rooms, but including the voices very much from the grassroots, particularly from activists that are representing some of the most marginalised groups in society. Hopefully we'll explore a little bit more of that in today's panel, but I wanted to highlight 3 specific things that really struck me as some potential ideas and solutions, and there were many. So apologies if I'm not able to bring some of your ideas into my recap here, but maybe they'll be picked up as we talk throughout this panel. But firstly, I wanted to highlight the importance of moving beyond solely the sole focus on risk to actually looking at an approach that's based on the existing resources of resilience within communities and putting them firmly in the design of our programming. Secondly, we also heard about the values, the democratic values that are there and how we should be bringing them much more right into the centre of the way that we work. These are values around participation, accountability, transparency, a focus on basic human rights, inclusion. How do we bring those much more firmly into the way that we do programming, but really centre our voices around them as well? And then finally, we also heard a lot about recognising the tremendous potential of good research and analysis for understanding the dimensions of challenges we face, but also helping and guiding us to improve the effectiveness of solutions. And the last panel that were here up on this stage, there was a call around data, and more data, which was very much a call that resonates with my own heart and my own background as well. So it's wonderful to see the importance of research and analysis coming up in all of the discussions too. So with that, I'm going to move on and introduce our panellists we have today. Today's panellists, it's a discussion, so I'm sorry we won't have time to come to the audience for questions, but hopefully our discussion will aim to bring together a lot of the things we've heard and seen from the various different panels, and we'll be able to pick that up and bring this forum for 2023 to a close. So on my left, I have Ugochi Daniels, who is the Director General for Operations for the International Organization of Migration. So Ugochi, welcome.
Thank you.
And then next to Ugochi, I have Habib Rehman Mayar, who is the Deputy General Secretary of the G7 Secretariat. So Habib, welcome, and lovely to have you with us. And then, of course, we have Dan Smith, who needs no introduction. He's our host, but he's also the Director of SIPRI, and he will be playing a big role in closing our session today as well. So, Dan, thank you so much. Ugochi, I'm going to start off with you, if I may, and I want to ask, what lessons stand out particularly for you around the importance of building coalitions for peace to take on some of the world's most pressing challenges?
Thank you, Harpinder, and hi, everyone. Once again, thank you to SIPRI for inviting me and other colleagues from IOM. So maybe a couple of things that really stand out to me and also were covered in the panel just before this. So apologies for some of you that are, it's like we've pressed replay for you, but for the benefit of those who are joining. So one thing that was very clear is around ownership, right? Ownership of local actors, not participation, not engagement, ownership, and real ownership of the solutions and how they define what it is they need for peace and development. The other key point, and you had mentioned it around data, but it's not just collecting data, it's understanding the context, doing really good conflict analysis, which often leads us to engage with those. The term that we used in the last panel is those who are not quite close to us, and being able to be flexible and agile enough to have this understanding of the context, knowing that it's very dynamic and changing. The critical role of youth and how to engage them meaningfully and what that will take. And many times, as we see with different organizations that work on peace work on peace, or work on development, or work on both, the different risk appetites. But the reality is, for those on the ground, for governments, for communities, for the people themselves, they're dealing with those risks every day, and a real commitment to working with all of the different actors who have a stake for peace and development in the community. And I have to say a point about engaging women, because, and this is what I've done for my career. Everybody talks about a commitment to gender, everybody has a policy on gender, everybody has a gender marker. Tick, 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 and time again, women are outside of the peacemaking process and are not meaningfully engaged. And yet, what the evidence shows is that when women are involved, we have much, not just the ownership, but sustainable outcomes. The end of the civil war in both Liberia and Sierra Leone, for which a Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, was exactly on this. So there's no way to overemphasize that. And maybe my final point on this particular question is the role of the diaspora. This is a stakeholder that has emerged over the past 10 to 15 years. Last year, diaspora remitted $800 billion. $800 billion is 4 times total ODA. There needs to, and the diaspora are asking to be at the table, to be part of the solution, and that they are critical stakeholders for peace and development in their countries of, particularly in their countries of origin. So we need to have platforms that enable them to engage in a pathway for peace and development. So maybe let me stop there.
Ugochi, that's fantastic. It's really interesting you bring up the diaspora example there as well, and also women and girls. If I can, I will just sort of dig deeper a little bit on some of the things you're saying there, because it's really important for us to think, what are the lessons for international organizations, multilateral organizations in particular, around how they need to change the way they work? Because at the end of the day, the crisis we're facing, the system is not delivering for those crises and for those people. How should it be changing? How should we be thinking about what's the role of the diaspora, what's the role of local communities in the international system to take us in the right direction?
So it's a great question. I was recently at the Global Diaspora Symposium, and that was the first time diaspora, government, the UN, civil society, academia were all in one room. And the diaspora said that this needs to not be a one-off, but a way of engaging, and that there needs to be platforms for this to continue. We're all very familiar with diaspora bonds, but they want to be seen beyond the remittances that they send, but also the skills and knowledge and capacities that they have. And to be very frank, what I've seen in my experience is many times when I go to a particular context where we're dealing with the aftermath of conflict, we're trying to build social cohesion, etc., the diaspora have been engaged from day one. They have, and if you look at, for example, the coming out of Ukraine and the movements of Ukrainians and third country nationals, you can almost map it with their diaspora in other countries. So there are numerous examples. In speaking to people who've been affected by conflict, when we asked what was their number one need, they wanted an ATM to receive transfers. It wasn't food, water, or shelter. It was the ATM and the ability to do digital transfers. So it's really about how, for those of us in the international community, it's really how do we bring this different actor, but with significant capacity, and who, by the way, is not waiting for the international community. They're going ahead. So it's to our advantage to not only engage them, but to make sure that our own tools are able to, I don't want to use the word leverage, it's overused, but take into account and have a multiplier, can achieve a multiplier effect. Right now, remittances are the key driver of human development in many, many countries. How can that work better in preventing conflict, in reducing fragility, in accelerating socioeconomic development of which it's the deficit that in many cases is driving the fragility?
I think that's fascinating, and it's really important for us to think about that ecosystem of financing and the role of different financing streams within that, and remittances are obviously a large player, but also domestic finance as well. Right. From what you're saying, and also what you've heard at the forum over the last couple of days, what lessons do you think the donors that we've had join us at this forum, what lessons should they be taking back from these discussions? So not just here, but in many of the fora that I participate in, we often have if it's a development-focused forum or gathering,
development actors, or if it's a humanitarian focused gathering, the humanitarian donors. It's having all of them together, thinking about how can we make the funding work better. The classic example is climate and how difficult it is for countries to access climate funding. And the classic example is Somalia and the drought they had last year, and they could not access any of the climate financing. So it's about making it, first of all, it's about having all the different funding streams and those who manage it speaking together, because we talk about the need for comprehensive approaches. It's the same on the financing, comprehensive and integrated. It's the same on the financing side. That's one, but it's also because the resources are limited, right? It's finite at some point. And how can it work more efficiently for the outcomes that the financing is meant to achieve?
Great, thank you. I'm going to just ask you one last thing, and then I'm going to move on to Habib, if that's okay. My one last point is, I know you've been on the road a lot, and you've been visiting a lot of the IOM, get the acronym right, operations on the ground, and it's incredible the scale of the operations. I just wanted to hear from you what you've learnt from the way that the programs are operating on the ground. What are the development solutions that you've seen that we should be thinking about much more as we close out this forum?
Gosh, that's almost like we can have a whole forum just on that. So maybe very quickly, for an organization like IOM, we are a proximate agency. We are in communities, and we are engaging local actors. Critically important to have the local context and the local engagement. But if we're talking about SDGs, the key lesson is how do you stay local but achieve at a national scale? And what is the diversity of partnerships that have to come together to be able to influence at a scale that is going to have impact, that's going to have real impact on SDG achievement. So that's one. And then the other thing is, because we know we're off track on the SDGs, we know what the impact of COVID was, what are the accelerators for achieving the SDGs? Certainly from the perspective of IOM, and I had talked about the role of remittances, but we need to be seeing how the ways in which we work, comprehensive, integrated, multi-stakeholder, etc., but that we are able to make impact at the right level. And there's absolutely no way we're going to be able to do that as a small collective. It's a large collective, and that recognizes the importance both at the national level and at the most local level, without being patronizing.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Habib, if I may. And Habib, I've seen you over the last few days. You've been engaged in a number of discussions and panels. I'm interested to hear from you about the insights that you'll be taking back from the forum, back to the G7+, and also if there's anything in particular that really surprised you that you've heard over the last few days.
No, thank you so much. First of all, the forum itself has been a great opportunity for us. The most surprising thing for me is to see us coming back after COVID-19 and seeing, again, known people, and thank to SIPRI for this forum. For us, I was particularly very excited to see that our countries, which are fragile and conflict-affected countries, are facing a short span of international attention. And with the brutal war on Ukraine, which I definitely sympathize with the people. I mean, having been a citizen of Afghanistan, which has lived occupation and aggression, more than 50 countries have been forgotten. I think this was said over and over, but what I saw here in the forum is that we have, citizens and voices from those countries which are less spoken about, from Yemen, from Somalia, from Cameroon, from other countries. Particularly my own country, Afghanistan, which has now unfortunately become a forgotten story, for reasons that we can talk about. And I was glad to see that somebody from Afghanistan, not exactly me, because I'm not speaking in the capacity as representing Afghanistan, but speakers from Afghanistan and talking about the situation. And I think this also shows a tendency on the international community part that there is a recognition that we have a history to learn from. And we have to look at what we did and how wrong or correct we were. Secondly, what also really is a takeaway for me is an increasing recognition of some of the principles that we, the G7 Plus, has been advocating since we were established. I mean, these are common words and terms: ownership, multilateralism, country context, country sensitivity, nexus between peace, development, and humanitarian. This is something that we built our organization to promote and advocate. And I saw that in different sessions, these were increasingly recognized. And it shows humility on part of the international community that there is at least a recognition. And of course, we have been hearing that we are in a turbulent time, and we need solutions. We need to get out of this. So it was great to see, and I think this is a kind of a reiteration on part of some of the multilaterals, the UN, some other multilateral institutions like the IMF and the others, which is music to our ear. Third, there was also a recognition that we need multilateral solutions. Multilateralism is becoming ever relevant, but we need to adapt to the new realities. It's great to see the leadership, on part of the UN, for example, recognizing that the multilateralism has to become more inclusive of the voices of the countries which are affected. One of the caveats that concerns us really is, we believe in multilateralism, but we also see that it has been hijacked by the geopolitical tension. So you have few, countries or few powers controlling the whole, institution, but then you have the rest, the majority of the countries or the people or citizens who have been affected, and who do not have much voice in those institutions. So I see there is a commitment on part of the leadership in the multilateral institutions, but it will pretty much depend again on the same powers or elite who control or who have stake there to make it a reality. And I think I don't need to say it. I think I also heard, I was quite happy to hear it from others, that recognizing that fact, that we need to change that. Fourth, we see that there is also a tendency on part of multilateral institutions, financial institutions like IMF, stepping up its resources and assistance for the world's fragile and conflict-affected states, which is great. We had recently a very good ministerial meeting with the IMF leadership, where there was exchange of views of how we can, become even more flexible and stepping up our resources. And one of the tools is that, they particularly mention is PRGT, the window that, give more concessional resources to the fragile conflict-affected states. But I wish it were only the IMF who could solve it. But again, it will depend on the donors, commitment to that, and also pledges, whether that will be possible or not. So that's great to see, and we are very keen to work. Now, also, I mentioned HDP Nexus not because I co-lead together with SIPRI and WFP and FAO and the rest of the coalition. I think there is now a tendency that we are opening it up. We are unpacking this concept of what it should mean on the ground and how can we operationalize it. in 2011, we launched the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States. Many of these rooms were, the actors here, but I hope they have not forgotten it. We proposed peace building and state building goals. It was actually the nexus between peace and state building and development. So it's a reiteration for us. It's not something new. We are not surprised because we know we have lived that nexus. So it's a reiteration for us that we see that there is an increasing recognition of that. But of course there are challenges on how to further step it up and operationalize it and make it work for the countries or the most vulnerable people in the globe. And my final word is on, I mentioned geopolitics. Of course, we are all witnessing, and I think it's repeatedly, we are saying that we are going through turbulent time. We wonder what will be our destiny. By our means, those countries which have been left behind for decades. I think we need to invest or we need to bring some solidarity into our international relations for the sake of those people, billions of people who have, not had a chance to have lasting peace and stability. We have increasingly become, vulnerable. And this is one message for our own selves, for our G7 plus countries as well, that, we depend on the mercy of the hegemonic powers. But at one point of time, we have to stand up. And I think the establishment of the G7 Plus was the beginning of that. And of course, we have come across in a very turbulent time. We are facing challenges on every step. We provide a platform for these countries to say, to voice their concerns about what is happening in the world. And, this is the only organization that, brings the regions across the regions. So we are really concerned when we hear about, the investment in the, military investment has been going up. And luckily, of course, there is no major confrontation among big powers, but it is not a relief for us. We have been victims of this for decades now. Where are these weapons, brought? Who are benefiting from that? And who are being the victim of that? We are really concerned about it. I have lived in Afghanistan. I have seen the aggression. We were receiving, this mass destruction of weapons, and we have to deal with the legacies. And I think for us, the 1.5 billion people, it's really concerning that, what will be our destiny if the big powers keep stuffing themselves with, arms. So yeah, that's.
Gosh, you've covered a lot of ground there. So I'm just wondering which direction shall I take this into next? I'm going to pick up on the inclusive multilateral system. You mentioned IMF doing much more funding. We know the World Bank is now one of the largest funders of projects in a fragile context as well. The UN has always been there. These two new institutions coming on board are actually much more closed than the UN institutions. What's the role of the G7 plus in helping ensure that they are more inclusive, they are hearing voices from the ground? What could we also here be doing more of to ensure that actually these forums aren't closed and making decisions behind closed doors, but there are voices from those countries where this money is going to as well?
I wish I could say that, but we could be mediators, among these big institutions and bringing them together. But on inclusion, one of our basic aims of the G7 Plus was to give a voice or to make the voice of the left behind or the farthest left behind countries heard on these institutions. We have engaged with the World Bank and IMF since 2012, and it has been great. During the IDA conversation, I personally attended, the IDA replenishment meetings as observers and active observers. And, we helped the World Bank to mobilize resources for the fragile and conflict-affected states. And also within the UN and also the other multilateral institutions, we give a platform to these countries to have a say in the design of the policies. And of course, the ideal situation would be where really we could, make a big difference in the way that these actors have engaged. But I think we have become a small bee in the ears of big elephants that, we are creating much noise that will definitely, make the elephant, move in a certain direction. So we have been advocating. One of the major milestones that we achieved in this regard was in 2019, the G7 Plus was granted an observer status at the United Nations. It's not only just a seat, but it's also a platform or a venue where we could bring the people from these countries, facilitate their voice to be shared with the United Nations in different resolutions, in different aspects of peace building and peacekeeping. And one other thing that we do is, earlier you mentioned about the source of resilience in these countries. And all these countries have the source of potential. It is inherited there. Of course, it's not very visible, because we always think about, we always look at the challenges and the difficulties. We don't look what could be the source of, or solutions or source of peace. These countries have some experiences which are not necessarily recorded or, documented internationally, which could inspire even the international community. So we have the fragile to fragile cooperation. It's a peer learning exercise among countries, that one conflict-affected countries provide support to the other conflict-affected countries. It is, lessons, they can be, even financial resources. And it also benefits international institutions by, bringing lessons which could prove as an evidence that, okay, what we are promoting, this can work, and this can help, you can reform. So if there is ever any appetite of, reforming these institutions to work better and to be more responsive to the needs, we have the evidence that you could do it by doing this way. But again, at the core of that is the willingness for humility, to accept that, yes, we need to change. And, sometimes we have country experts or, country, institutions. Without much knowledge of the countries, we are just imposing the solution that we think is right for us. So we are trying to change that direction, that, the international community, the international institutions should be in a more, listening mode and to understand. And that's where then we can make the principle of ownership really, realized in these countries.
Yeah, and that's been echoed throughout the last 2 days very strongly, and I think it's the one theme that has run across pretty much every single panel, which is really interesting and good to hear. As building on that, how could the relationship be strengthened between the G7 and the G7 Plus? Where is there room for engagement there and taking that forum forward as well?
I think I heard in one of the panel discussions that we will have the G7 meeting, the big G7 meeting, and the outcome or the effectiveness will be determined by the fact who sits there. So I earlier mentioned that the multilateralism has been hijacked. Sorry if I don't mean to offend anyone here by hijack, but this is the reality. It will depend on whether if they're really trying to talk about the global issues and global solutions which affect everyone. We have, some of the members of the G7 are, part of the international dialogue on peace building and state building, which is a tripartite, platform, where G7 plus civil societies and donors sit there. Some of the members are part of that conversation. But we have, from the very beginning, I think for the last 3-4 years, we have tried to have, a representation there as observer, we have said it again and again that we can bring a president from any of these countries where they could speak of, the issues which are less spoken of again. In 2018, there was a resolution from the G7, I think it was when it was presided by France, where they recognized the international dialogue and also recognized the fragile to fragile cooperation in the G7+. So we thought that this is a very good move. But I think more than that has to be done because most of our countries are dependent on aid, which mainly come from these big industrialized nations, and our ambition is to go and have a more tangible voice on how we can inform some of what our narratives according to the issues have been. Like for example, the disproportionate impact of COVID and also the Ukraine war on our countries. We are trying to see if we could, have a venue over there. We could, share some of these concerns, and also maybe bring some solutions there as well. As I said, we would like to be, inspiring globally, the tension that has been going on, and I think the G7 plus, the very formation of the G7 plus can be inspiring for the rest of the world as well. Most of the times we have multilateral institutions who are based on regionally, economically vested, agenda, but ours is across the region. We don't have any criteria. We don't have any, any vested interest in each other's affairs. For us, the only vested interest is that is peace and stability. And very importantly, and I'm sure that international relation experts will not agree, or they might be, they might think that I don't make sense. We introduced the concept of solidarity in the international cooperation. And I think by our engaging with the G7, I think that could be something that where we could make the difference on that. Yeah.
That's great. Before I go to Dan, I'm going to ask one piece of advice for Peace Forum. We're obviously coming to a close. There will be an evaluation from this as well, but also we've got the Paris Peace Forum coming up later on in the year. What's missing from your perspective in this Peace Forum that we should be considering here? It might be communities, might be issues. What would you like to see more of?
First of all, on a macro level, I think, we are missing reconciliation and peaceful means to resolving conflicts from the big conflicts. I'm talking about, the conflict among big powers. Again, I might not make big sense to the international relation experts because, international relation is driven by real politic, the realism. But I think we don't have any way out. We have heard this again and again that we are living in a mutually assured, destructive, mad world. And I will borrow the word of Stefan that, we have to make it a mass, mutually assured survival. I think that is something which is missing. I personally haven't heard a lot about this, that there should be a peaceful means to these conflicts. And the second thing, again, I will repeat it, and it might be a paradigm shift. I'm a naive person. I'm not expert in international relation. The survival of human being was based on cooperation. One reason that the species, survived was cooperation, their ability to cooperate. And I think now is the time where we could say that, without cooperation as human beings, and that has to be based on the human solidarity. And I'm going to repeat it, on a human solidarity. Because we are living, we have been hearing that, okay, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this is it was not only true in the context of COVID, but it's true very much now. And I think that notion of solidarity is missing from this whole conversation. And I think we need to bring that up. We need to give, we need to empower the people. I'm talking as a citizen who has lived war for the last 4 decades. I never remember when was the last time when we had, lasting peace and stability. So I think we need to step this up. And I'm sorry to say it, but I really hear this from the experts that, the foreign relation experts, saying that.
That's great. And often we need a non-expert to find a solution that the experts can't find. So I think more voices of non-experts are hugely welcome to the challenges that we're all grappling with. With that, I'm going to move over to Dan. Dan, I'm curious if you might be classified as an expert. So I hope you're okay with that label. I'm curious to hear from you, what's really challenged your thinking through the last couple of days, specifically regarding peace building? What have you heard that's really challenged you and made you rethink things a little?
Yes, I'm not an expert. I know a very little about a very lot of things, so I'm a generalist. First of all, I want to say I've found so many of the conversations that I've had or that I've heard, I've participated in, the panels and so on, have been really interesting, masses of evidence, interesting arguments, deep analysis, good ideas, positive recommendations, and a good spirit. But you're asking what challenged me. And what I feel challenged by is kind of 2 sides of the same coin, and that coin could be summed up as it was by a very good friend of mine this morning when we were chatting over coffee at the beginning. It's the grumpy old man syndrome. So first of all, the grumpy old man gets irritated because he has heard all of this before. right? So it's how much of this is familiar. We've been talking about inclusivity, ownership, country context, knowledge, incorporating gender and other markers of different ethnicities, different class. We've been talking about power differentials and so on for a couple of decades. So, yes, I'm challenged by the fact that these are still problems and that we're still trying to solve them. And then the grumpy old man then turns around when something else is said to him and says, oh, now you're bringing up new stuff. So I'm challenged by what's old and familiar, and I'm also challenged by the new things that we now have to think about, which we've been discussing from the beginning. And I think that the first panel, which I was moderating when Comfort and Frank and Valerie were talking about layered problems. Mm-hmm. And there are aspects of that which we did not so much need to be thinking about, or thought we didn't need to be thinking about a couple of decades ago. So peace building as an idea essentially comes out in the early 1990s in Boutros Ghali, the then UN Secretary General, his report on Agenda for Peace. And it takes a while before the notion gets real traction. And for a considerable period of time, it was actually seen as being about post-conflict peace building. In the early 2000s, about 2002, I was invited to lead a study that would involve 4 countries, Norway, Netherlands, Germany, and the UK, to evaluate their peace-building experience of the previous, as it turned out, we took a 5-year time frame. And we built up with 4 country teams working, and I was sort of responsible for the synthesis report. We put together a database of about 350 peace-building projects funded by those 4 governments in 14 countries, I think. And what we found was a horrible, what we called a strategic deficit. In the majority of projects, there was no linkage whatsoever between the project and a strategy for development or peace in the country where it was being implemented. And in the kind of 45% or so of projects which did make a link, it was gestural. It was not a nuanced, think it through strategy. So the thing we said was, get the act together, you've got to think strategically. And that was kind of peace building 2.0, if you like. And now I feel as if we're somewhere into peace building 3.0 and 4.0 coming at us both at the same time. 3.0, choose your order. One of them is geopolitics. Right? In the first decade of this century, thinking about peace building, as the UN Peacebuilding Commission was established, as the Peacebuilding Fund was set up and got going, we were working in a post-Cold War world. Yeah. We were working in a world where more peace agreements were being made because the UN Security Council was working together, where more peace-building agreements were lasting for longer because the funding was coming through to support them. And of course there were horrors going on during this period. There was Darfur, there was Afghanistan, there was the war in Iraq and the chaos that was unleashed, and there were others as well. But the number of armed conflicts was coming down and peace agreements were getting more durable, and this was an expansion of the world zone of peace, and we didn't think we had to think too much about geopolitics, and now we know we do. And there are some people who will say, well, you were living in an illusory world in the first decade, and others will say, well, the world has changed, and be a little bit more generous to us of 2005. But now we know we need to be thinking about geopolitics. And then the other thing, and this perhaps is something that has started to come through more strongly recently, is that we're also living in a world which is being changed, which is changing because of climate change, because of global warming, and in which, and I'm sorry, there are many people in the audience whom I've been bugging with my 5 nightmares over recent weeks, and I apologize therefore to all the staff of SIPRI and everybody else to whom I've sent my paper on, or co-authored paper on 5 urgent questions on ecological security. But there's a much wider and deeper set of challenges within the biosphere, within the ecosphere, which are having in some cases, and predictably are going to have in other cases, impacts upon peace and security. So if we're thinking about peace building, I think where we're getting to is that we need to be thinking in terms of three overlapping circles. There's kind of national security, violence, armed force, that. There's the one of human, that is summed up by human security and thinking about human development, and there's the one that is summed up by thinking about ecological security, which includes climate change, air pollution, and a bunch of other things. And the most difficult challenges in the security sphere and in the peace-building sphere are where those three circles overlap in a perfect Venn diagram and create that center where you have a combined crisis of violence, human insecurity and lack of human development, and the ecological crisis. And it doesn't matter what the causal direction is of this. I mean, in Ukraine, you would not be saying that there are environmental drivers of this conflict to begin with, but there are enormous environmental impacts. In other places, you would be able to see the environmental and food insecurity drivers, but then you can see the violence and the human development problems. So it's that overlapping of the three circles. And I think this is why we're talking about some things which are familiar and some things which are quite new, which is what I have found. I mean, yeah, you asked a question of challenging. So, listen, when I was at university, what we did was we worked out the answer to the exam question, right? And we went into the exam with it, and then we saw the exam question, and the first paragraph you spent distorting the meaning of the question to fit your answer. And the last paragraph distorted the meaning of your answer to fit the question. So you asked me about challenges, but you could have asked me, well, what did I find really refreshing? And I'd have probably said the same thing.
Yeah, that's to be expected. It's your prerogative to decide how you're going to answer, but I'm going to push a little bit further, if I may, on that.
Absolutely.
You know, the critical thing that we need to be taking away from this forum is actually turning a lot of this talk into action. Mm-hmm. Making sense of what we've been discussing and actually agreeing what is my role in how I need to change to actually make a difference on the ground. Wherever you work in this system that we're operating in, what are you going to be taking away and doing differently? And how do you think some people in this room can be taking some of those challenges, but also the refreshing ideas, and taking them away and thinking about how we shape the policy dialogue that we're involved in, or potentially the implementation programs that we're delivering on?
So to start with, I'll start with thinking about SIPRI, and maybe this is generalizable to other research. First of all, there is a kind of way of doing research, which is field research in the countries fragile, conflict affected, and so on, where you go in, you ask a few questions, you get your answers, you head out, and you sit back home, and right? And there's a good expression for that kind of research. It's extractive. Some very valuable extractive research has been done, but it remains extractive. So I think that the first thing is to start thinking about how we can do research in a way which is itself a process of inclusion and dialogue, and in which you've used the word humility several times, and it really needs to be foregrounded in our thinking. You may indeed be expert. You may have your PhD from wherever it is, from Harvard, Cambridge, Uppsala, Sorbonne, wherever. But go in with humility, knowing that you can learn. But at the same time, knowing also that in the exchange, you will also give. Right? And as people always say, giving is more blessed than to receive. So that's an important part, that there's an interaction in that. I think the second thing that I think about in terms of the Institute and research in general, and this is something that we've been talking about already as we discuss our strategy for a coming 5-year period, is taking a little bit more seriously the educational role. I mean, obviously, in some sense, we're part of the educational world because we find stuff out, we write it down, and we put it out in as best we can, and as widely as we can, and as clearly as we can. But a little bit beyond that, I think that we need to become a bit more involved in working with people, with different communities. This can, by the way, as well be communities in Europe and amongst experts, as it might be communities in the Sahel and West Africa, where we have an active program, or in relation to China and Northeast Asia and so on. But it's more engagement with the idea that what we have, what we know, there's also some value here, and we need to broaden out the communities of knowledge and practice. And I think beyond that, the other thing that I would say is that then maybe what I'm talking about is agencies of all kinds, institutions of all kinds, that sort of reevaluate their role a bit and see what, I think we're all quite good at saying, well, I'm a research institute, so I do research, publish it, boom, that's my job. Actually, because of our statutes, SIPRI has never completely had that view. Our statutes say that there's a reason why we're doing research, which is to attempt to contribute to a more peaceful world. So if we were using any serious metric, we're not doing too well at the moment, but we're doing our very best. But I think that many institutions have this kind of single focus, and maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's time to be thinking about, well, what else? Whether you're the G7 Plus or the International Organization of Migration, or maybe an aid agency, what other things are there that can be done which are supportive of the broad goal?
Great, thank you. Building on that, you've obviously just hosted the Peace Forum. What will you potentially do differently next year with the Peace Forum to build on what you've heard today, but also what you're saying in the role of being an educator, so
right.
making sure that we're playing that role well, producing research. I've just come out of a role of 10 years of leading a think tank. Gosh, is our work important, but if it's not reaching the right people in the right way at the right time, it really doesn't have the impact that you're intending it to have. So what could the Stockholm Forum be doing differently next year to what you've done this year?
Well, I think that, first of all, you're really asking me that question too early, because I haven't even got to take a deep breath, count to 10 and start thinking. But and especially the people who actually know about how to organize it, who are sitting out there desperately hoping that he doesn't say something that commits them to something impossible. You know who you are.
They'll
and I
be
know what you're
making hand
thinking.
signals.
Yes, that's right. There's these kind of signs going on from the back of the room. So I think the first thing is that we'll be asking you. We want to know. What we did this year was we decided that we're working in everybody is working in a different political and funding environment, and we were unable to do some of the things that we have done last year and in the pre-pandemic times. So we needed to ask you all to be actually basically carrying more of the cost. So therefore, in order to make that possible for some, we compacted the forum, right? So instead of starting on Monday morning or Monday lunchtime and running until Wednesday afternoon, we brought it down to 2 days. Now, we then cheated. Having brought it down to 2 days, we organized some very interesting pre-sessions, and actually there's some post-sessions and so on and so forth. But we brought it down to 2 days. And that means that some of the sessions have been quite short. They've all been under time pressure. One could argue that if you allow an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes for a session on a really interesting topic with really good panelists, you still get time pressure. But we'd like to have feedback about that. Is that the right set of choices that we made? We certainly think that the role of the partner organizations is fundamental. As I said on the first day, we were working with 42 partner organizations on this. And we regard ourselves more as curators than, we hang some of our own paintings we hang in the gallery for the exhibition, but mainly we're hanging other people's work and doing some organization to get that together. I think that we would like it to be, yet bigger, yet more inclusive. We can see some groups, some communities which are not too well included. But to be honest, for the most part, I feel as if this has been pretty successfully done. This is also a reason why you shouldn't have asked me right now, because I'm feeling a bit proud of what the team has done.
Good.
And I think that we will try to look at things that we might have done better, but we will be pushing along on the same way. What we want to see is a really widespread global conversation about these issues, in which this forum is just one part. But we really want it to be a part which the people who come to it value. Put this time of year into your calendars already, and don't let anything else invade it until you find out when the next forum is.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. And sorry to have put you on the spot,
no
but I don't
worries.
think your team fell over outside with anything you said.
Everybody
Just,
feeling okay?
they're still there.
Feeling okay?
They're all still there. Well, look, we're getting to the end of our time, and so I'm going to turn back to Ugochi, and just to give Ugochi yourself and Habib one final summary comment that you'd like to make to bring us to a close, and then Dan, I'm going to hand over to you to actually then close us out, if I may. And I think you get more than 1 minute, and one comment you get 5 minutes. So Ugochi, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll start off with Dan and his comments, and I'm really pleased, I'm pleasantly surprised that I leave very optimistic. And why is that? So Dan talks about the grumpy old man, and I'm extremely proud of the fact that I can talk about the positive, determined, consistent activist. And this is over a very long journey. I work at the UN Agency for Migration. I never dreamed that this is where I was going to end up. I'm Nigerian. I had to leave Nigeria during the Civil War. Sweden played a big role. I'm sure whenever I mention to people I'm Nigerian, most people say, I went to school with someone who's Nigerian. I come from from Eastern Nigeria, which was from Biafra, which was the part of Nigeria that wanted to succeed. My people are traders and travelers. We value education and we value business because we feel that the government, that's the way we're going to develop. We're not going to wait for somebody to assist us to develop. And I'm saying all of this because Dan mentioned the list of the familiar. And in a way, the familiar, still being familiar and repeated, is reassuring because the familiar is based on years, decades of experience. So it's still valid and it's still important. But you also talked about 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. And again, if I use my example, the importance of the social contract. Because the politics, the geopolitics, the realpolitik, whatever term you want to use, is the reality. And I'm an optimist, but on this particular issue, I don't see an immediate resolution in sight. And of course, that underscores the critical role of multilateralism. But going back to this issue of the social contract, as a person from my community, anywhere I go in the world, if I get there, I can look for my community in that part of the world. And why am I looking? It'll be a group. Why am I looking for that group? Because that group is supporting its community back home. And we have a whole range of fees for burials, fees for school, fees for roads, fees for whatever it is that the community requires. It's a social contract with our people back home. And going back to the point that I made about diaspora, going back to the point about the role remittances are playing, and your point about humility. If we think about the Venn diagrams and the space that we occupy in the global circle, it's a small space. And in that big space is a social contract that is happening, that is active, that is supporting development, and is going to continue with or without us. So our ability to bring in those or reach out to and engage with them where they are, that are enabling a social contract, is critically important. And I'm optimistic that even though we have the challenges of geopolitics, even though multilateralism and international assistance is a small part, we still have these discussions where we recognize that 3.0 and 4.0 are happening, and what that, and what that space is. So I'm optimistic because I know the offer, UN Migration Agency, I know the offer migration makes to the social contract, and I know that yes, there's climate change, and yes, there are huge challenges ahead, but with a social contract and an investment in social cohesion and that the cohesiveness, that we will be able to have the fundamental basis for whatever reconstruction, infrastructure, basic services needs to happen for development. So, all due respect to the grumpy old man, but I'm the diehard activist, optimist, will remain in the trenches, will continue supporting operations that are done in a way that support that social contract. That's my key takeaway.
That's wonderful, thank you. Habib, from Social Contract, over to you.
Yeah. So I'm also going to pick on a point of, hard-dying activists. The G7 Plus is a group, is an activist.
Yay.
And activists of countries that have, that have seen all devastations over decades. So 3 points, or maybe 3 takeaways that we are going to, and we are already starting working on that. One is a self-reflection. One of the things that it was a groundbreaking for us, recognizing our own fragility. We didn't shy away from being called fragile. We say, okay, let's hang on. They call us fragile, failing, failed states. Let's have an inward look. What is it that makes us fragile? And this is something that we have, reiterated. We recently initiated what we call G7 Plus election observers, where we launch, we station our observers in each other countries. And of course, we are newcomers to the democracy, if I may, which we are not, but, most of our countries are very rich in the civilization where, democracy was there. But we are trying to, raise our voice there and also see where we could learn from each other, what incremental changes that we are making in our democracies or in our stability that are not captured, because the international system, I'm sorry, is too sophisticated to, capture those incremental changes, to reflect on that and to learn from that. And also, on the same note, we are starting, to be even more hard on the pursuit of national reconciliation and dialogue. Even during this meeting, I had the chance to talk to a couple of partners, including FBA, where we would want to see that we need we need support, moral, political support in some of our countries that are experiencing conflict, because for us, one of the success factors of some of the countries like Timor-Leste or countries in Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, they close the chapter, the past chapter, and they have to open a new one. So we are trying to promote that one. Secondly, I mentioned on the multilateralism that has to become inclusive. With our observer status at the UN, our ambition and our aspiration is that we need to be on the floor or on the room, at the room where peacekeeping or peace building missions are designed. It should not be more about who contributes to what. We have this motto, we say nothing about us without us. And we need to make sure that, what they're designing is we are not only just on the recipient end, but we have to be on the dialogue. And the same will continue with the IMF and also with the World Bank on that. And the final point on the same note is that, as I mentioned, there are some very inspiring examples and lessons that we can share with each other. And we under our Fragile to Fragile cooperation, we are trying to promote that even more. And we are also engaging with non-G7 Plus countries, who has inspired us, Rwanda, Cambodia, Colombia, there are countries around the world, which we want to engage with and, out of solidarity, bring that exchange together. So that's my takeaway.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think incremental changes, the small gains. I really appreciate you bringing in nothing without us, about us without us, which is really important. But solidarity, I think solidarity has been a core theme of what you've been saying throughout our panel. Thank you so much for that. With that, Dan, I'm going to hand over to you to close us out, if you may.
Thank you. And before I start with closing the panel, I want to thank Harpinder and Ugochi and Habib for being really great co-panelists. So thank you very much. Thank you. I have another bunch of thank yous to issue, which I'm issuing on behalf of the majority of the people in the room who would be surprised, possibly shocked, and some of the more kind of equitably minded of you horrified by how small a team it is that puts this together. Right? Now, the team, the people I'm going to mention, they're back there. We have a kind of a reference group within the institute which meets and gives advice. But the hard work is done by a couple of people in particular, whom lots of you have been in email contact with, which is Martina Selmy, who's the kind of the producer, and Simona Bunso, who's the showrunner. And then from time to time, you've asked for information from people who have been kind of clearly helpful, or you've seen people running in a panic-stricken way from one end of the room to another looking for somebody or something. And they were probably, amongst them, Lukas Victorson, Amelie Lutz, Daniela Crimella, and Noah Bell. And thank you all very much for that. And then a large part of this effort is also driven forward by a more broader outreach team led by Stephanie Blenkner. And thank you to Stephanie as well. And what I want to say, finishing off, I think it's so interesting to hear, as we're facing these big challenges, and as we try to figure out what these layered problems and therefore layered solutions are that we need to keep on working on, implementing, refining, studying, getting into policy, getting into training, and so on. As we talk about those persistently, two broader themes come up, one being the social contract, which Ugochi emphasized, and one being multilateralism, which Habib emphasized. And why is it that those two themes come up? Well, I have a kind of philosophical reason for my understanding of why that is. And that is because if you look at historical patterns, and if you look around the world today, successful societies, judging success by the well-being of people, successful societies cooperate. Now, individual success can often be gained by somebody who doesn't cooperate and breaks the rules and is ruthless. Right? But the collective as a whole benefits from the cooperation. And this is also true on a global scale. A successful world, measured by the well-being of people, is a world that cooperates. Of course, an individual state can break the rules, and does break the rules, and the capacity to break the rules depends on the power. And you were mentioning realism, right? So I'm going to go back to the Greek writer who is often regarded as one of the founding figures of realism, Plutarch, who in a dialogue between the Athenians who are powerful and the Melians who are weak, the Melians ask for justice, right? And the Athenians reply, you ask for justice, but you know full well in this world that the powerful do what we can and the weak do what they must. Right? That is the world of non-cooperation. That is the world of breaking the laws, breaking the rules all the time. That's not the world that we want to see. And therefore, there is a fundamental ethical drive. And ethics, if you think about them, are almost entirely built around the principle of cooperation. Right? So that, and we should not be ashamed about saying this, we're talking about wanting a world in which ethics is taken seriously. The ethics between people, the ethics between states, the ethics between governments and people, where the social contract is recognized, where multilateralism is operational, successful, and inclusive. And then, as a small bit of that, that's where we think that also our ethics in relation to as many people as we can manage, to all of you, to be fully cooperative and inclusive. This conversation moves forward. Please stay part of it in the interim, and I hope to see you all and more again this time next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.